Okay, you know what? I've seen other people enjoying it. I think I'm ready to buy a Tesla. That's great. Are you making sure you get the 4980s on those methotrexate cells? Huh? Well, you just know aluminum carbide needs to be prioritized if you're going prismatic with the pyramids. Are you talking to me? All I'm saying is I'm grateful that those 1790s have moved on from the silicon nanotube cathode anodes. Yeah. Is this you? Have you bumped into battery armchair experts and wondered what the heck is everyone on YouTube talking about these days? Well, fret no more, because in today's video we'll be diving into basically all of the different battery packs and chemistries and formats that Tesla uses across their vehicle lineup so that you don't feel as alone in discussions online with a bunch of nerds. Let's begin. Yes, I know on this channel we talk a lot about battery formats and chemistries and where they come from, but I've definitely gotten my fair share of questions where people are going, I don't even know what you're talking about anymore, this is like a different language, and it's definitely been a few months now of people saying, can't you do just like a Tesla battery breakdown for beginners, for those of us new viewers that are trying to get more into electric vehicle content but aren't entirely sure what you're saying half the time. And the issue with making these types of videos is that it's always changing, so within the next couple months this video could already be dated, but I figured, you know, there probably will never be a perfect time if I'm just hoping that Tesla stops changing their chemistries. They're always changing things up, so I might as well just start now. And I figured, because this video is supposed to be targeted at like new viewers, I'm basically gonna start with the most simple vehicle breakdowns and then work our way up to the more complicated ones. But the important thing to remember is that if you're in the market for a Tesla, none of this stuff really matters all that much. There's little things you might want to be aware of in regards to which vehicles qualify for tax credits or charging habits and that kind of thing, but for the most part, Tesla has wonderful active management systems for their battery packs that make sure all of the chemistries last a long time and you don't have to think much about it once you get your car. So let's start with one entire half of the sexy lineup that has very similar battery specs over the past 10 years, the Model S and Model X. Both of these vehicles have 100 kilowatt hour battery packs. 100 kilowatt hours is basically the electric vehicle equivalent of how big is the gas tank, like how much energy can the vehicle fit inside of it. And ever since the 2012 Model S, they have not strayed too far from this formula. They've been using 1865 cells, and when we say 1865, we're referring to the dimensions of the cylindrical cells that kind of look like AA batteries, but that's referring to 18 millimeters across and 65 millimeters down. And you can pack a lot of those cells into a full-size sedan or a full-size crossover, and they're fairly energy dense. They're manufactured by Panasonic over in Asia, so they are imported battery packs. Not that it matters, because the Model S and X are so expensive anyway, they're likely not going to qualify for any federal tax credits anytime soon. But the reason Tesla continues to use these 1865 cells, even though yes, they have improved their energy density with time, as in they can build them for cheaper as years have gone on and they've ramped production, and they can fit more watt hours per kilogram into these cells as they produce them at higher and higher volume. The reason they're still using them though is because they are mostly geared for performance. Model S and X vehicles, even the non-plaid ones that just have two motors, I know that's crazy, only two motors, right? They still can do 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds. They're still incredibly fast vehicles, especially if you consider how heavy they are. And at least the way I understand it is when you have smaller cells that are each able to output a bunch of energy at once, that allows you to basically dump a bunch of power into your powertrain and accelerate very, very quickly, and that's more optimized for acceleration and horsepower more so than anything, which is why, at least right now, Tesla's only using 1865 cells in the Model S and X. They're not really using it anywhere else. What Tesla mostly uses are 2170 cells, so same kind of concept of being cylindrical, as in it looks like a cylinder, but it's a little bit bigger. It's the same chemistry as the 1865 cells, which means the battery is relying on nickel, manganese, and cobalt on the inside to store all of that energy. But now it's a bit bigger, like I said, 21 millimeters across, now 70 millimeters down. And this is what they started putting in the Model 3 and Model Y when production initially begun. And there's still a lot of Model 3s and Ys being built with 2170 cells. These are a bit more optimized for production scaling. Most of the ones, at least in the United States, that Tesla uses are built at Giga Nevada, which is in Reno. So because it's domestic, domestically produced vehicles that use the 2170 cells, at least right now, qualify for the full federal tax credit. And not only is this common for Tesla to use, but it also appears to be one of the most plentiful cells in the business, because Lucid Air, if you've heard of them, is also using 2170 cells. Rivian, at least for now, is still using 2170 cells in their pickup trucks and SUVs. Canoo, which is barely producing vehicles, but they're still using 2170 cells in their vehicle. And when Aptera starts production, they're starting off with 2170 cells in their battery pack. So essentially right now, for vehicle grade batteries, 2170 cells are the most energy dense, or at least the most cost effective way to get a decent sized battery pack in your vehicle. So that's why it seems to be kind of the industry standard for a lot of companies. And while Tesla hasn't explicitly told us what the Tesla semi-trucks are using, Elon did mention on a previous earnings call that they're not using 4680 batteries, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And because they're building the Tesla Semi at limited production at Giga Nevada, the same exact place where they build all the 2170 cells, that's why most of us are assuming all the Tesla Semis on the road that are being driven around by Tesla and by Pepsi are likely using 2170 cells as well, which makes sense because, at least right now on the market, they're the highest energy dense cell that you can put in a vehicle, and when semi-trucks have weight limits that they cannot exceed, it makes sense to put the highest energy dense cell you can in it. So likely around 1 megawatt hour packs, that's 10 times the size of the Model S and X, but just in 2170 cells. So yes, a much bigger vehicle needs a much bigger battery pack to move a lot more payload. And as we're approaching the more common Teslas on the road, the Model 3 Performance is still guaranteed to get the full $7,500 tax credit because it is using those 2170 cells from Giga Nevada. But where we're getting into more of a gray area and some new battery chemistries are the standard range Model 3, which yes, on Tesla's website, they technically just refer to it as the Model 3 rear-wheel drive, but that's already starting to become confusing for more international markets because in a few places in Europe, they're starting to bring back the long-range rear-wheel drive Model 3. So now when you say rear-wheel drive, that doesn't explicitly mean standard range unless you're in the United States. But the standard range Model 3 is the one I have purchased and have been driving now for a while. And this does not use cylindrical cells. These use prismatic cells, which is another way of just saying rectangular boxes. So they don't look like little AA batteries stacked in the floor of the car. Now they look like a bunch of just square, flat books, I guess you could say it, that all just kind of slide into the battery pack. And these are using a different chemistry from both the 1865 cells and the 2170s, which are both relying on nickel, manganese, and cobalt. So that's what that acronym stands for if you see people referring to it on the web, NMC. But what the standard range Model 3s are using, both in the United States and in Asia, is what we refer to as LFP, which stands for lithium iron phosphate. F stands for iron on the periodic table, long story. But this different chemistry is less energy dense, which means you have to have heavier battery packs to store the same amount of energy, but it does not require those expensive elements like nickel and manganese and cobalt. There's a lot of concern about the use of cobalt in battery packs because of some unethical mining practices that have been documented. Tesla is doing third-party audits to ensure that their battery packs do not rely on cobalt, and the sad fact is whatever device you're watching this video on is probably got cobalt in its battery pack already, but that's where the advantages of lithium iron phosphate come in. Because it's just relying on iron and phosphate and lithium, it's a lot cheaper to build. And so far, most of Tesla's lithium iron phosphate batteries are all coming from a Chinese company called CATL, and because they're so cheap, they'd rather import them into the United States and build those vehicles with these battery packs because even though they're less energy dense, they're still overall cheaper, and there's some other advantages that come from having a battery pack that's less energy dense. Like, for example, the cycle life is much higher with lithium iron phosphate. And when I say cycle, I'm referring to using the battery pack's full capacity. That doesn't necessarily mean 100% to zero. Like, for example, if you just went from 100% down to 80% and then back up to 100 and you did that 5 times, that would be one cycle. So using as much energy out of the battery pack as the pack can store considers one cycle, and having a smaller battery pack, as in the vehicle's range, isn't as good as other vehicles that are using the more energy dense cells like the nickel, manganese, cobalt cells, including 1865s and 2170s. That's where you'd want a higher cycle life because when you have less range, you're gonna eat through those cycles a bit faster. So, like for example, if you had a Model S with a 400-mile range and you drove it 400,000 miles, that would be 1,000 cycles on the battery pack. Whereas when you have a standard range Model 3, which has, say, a 250-mile range, you only have to drive drive 250,000 miles to hit 1,000 cycles. And the good news is all of Tesla's battery packs, whether they have nickel or LFP, still have very high cycle lives, and there's people that are telling me on Twitter all the time, and Tesla's done their own research showcasing that vehicles can get well over 200,000 miles and still have very little degradation, or, you know, the battery pack isn't able to hold as much energy as it used to. That happens with all batteries. Your phones do it, your car batteries do it too. As you drive it more and more, the battery pack deteriorates a little bit. But most of the data that people have done researching how the energy depletes over time is showcasing that there's hardly any loss, even with tens of thousands of miles on these cars. And there's many Model 3 and Y owners out there that have well over 100,000 or 200,000 miles on their car, and they still have 85 to 90% of their original rated capacity. So not something to worry about like, oh no, my battery pack needs to be replaced in 5 years. No, that was a problem with the older like Toyota Priuses, but not really an issue with today's chemistries. But the other cool perk of having a cycle life so high, which means very little degradation after hundreds of thousands of miles of driving, is that with lithium iron phosphate Teslas like the standard range Model 3, you can actually charge them to 100% on a daily basis. With nickel manganese cobalt cells, because they're very energy dense, they actually deteriorate a bit faster when they're at their maximum capacity and just left there, which is why, thankfully, Tesla makes this really easy for you if you do have a Tesla with nickel manganese cobalt cells. By default, it will cap your charging at 80%, and you can tell it to charge to full, but it recommends that you don't do that unless you're taking a big road trip. So for daily driving, 80% should be just fine because you already have a long-range EV, but if you're wanting to take a longer trip, that's when you can top it off to 100% and start driving pretty quickly after you get to that full charge. Whereas with lithium iron phosphate, there's not much deterioration that goes on even when the battery pack is charged to full. And because the lithium iron phosphate battery packs are so stable, they're actually less likely to catch fire, for one, which is cool, but even the nickel manganese cobalt cells are 10 times less likely to catch on fire than a traditional gas vehicle, so it's not like catching fire is an issue with any of these cell chemistries, but LFP is still less combustible in the first place, but it also has pretty much a similar voltage no matter what the state of charge is of the battery pack, which means that even if the battery pack is depleted down to 10% or 5%, you still have full power to the motor, whereas with Tesla vehicles relying on nickel, manganese, and cobalt, those cells have more noticeable voltage sag, as in the battery pack can't output as much power as the cells deplete their charge, but that voltage sag is partly how Tesla is able to figure out what is the state of charge of the battery pack. So for the battery percentage to be accurate in your car, they actually can't use that same method with lithium iron phosphate because it has the same voltage no matter what the state of charge is. So in order to properly calibrate the state of charge, they actually they encourage you to charge it to full at least once a week, so that once the battery pack is full, that sends a message to the battery management system and it goes, okay, now we can recalibrate, we're at 100% again, and then it measures based on how much energy you're using what the state of charge is. But there's little losses and little inaccuracies over time if you're not charging it to full, which is why they straight up tell you that both in the mobile app and on the Tesla's display, hey, you have an iron-based battery pack, so you want to charge it to full. So that's what the standard range Model 3 is relying on, and where it gets into a gray area that we're not completely sure about is the recently announced long-range Model 3, which doesn't have the same range as before, but it has a very similar weight as before. And because it doesn't qualify for the $7,500 tax credit, most people are assuming this is a variation on LFP, so it's likely not cylindrical cells, it's probably not 2170 cells, because we had a long-range Model 3 last year with 2170 cells, and the range was nearly 360 miles, where this one that they're just bringing back says 325 plus miles, and yet the weight is still really high, so a lot of people are speculating. We don't know for sure. Correct me in the comments if you're watching this after it's been confirmed what the battery pack is, but a lot of people are speculating it's a new chemistry from CATL, the same company that manufactures Tesla's lithium iron phosphate battery packs, that is mixing in a little bit of manganese. So there's still no nickel or cobalt, which are the expensive elements, but by mixing in a little bit of manganese with that iron phosphate, they're able to increase the energy density. So theoretically, that would mean that you still have the high cycle life, but you still can get the longer range, which to me sounds like the best of both worlds. But again, we still don't really know for sure what it's using, so I'm not going to speculate too much on that. But where it gets really, really complicated is the Model Y, because this is the vehicle that is Tesla's bestseller. It's kind of like the Swiss Army knife of Tesla's. It's got the hatchback, it's got the storage space, it's got the affordability, it's got all-wheel drive. It's basically their flagship EV. This is most of what Tesla's building, and they're building it in 4 different factories across the world. And because of that, Tesla kind of has the Baskin-Robbins approach of all kinds of different battery packs are going into the Model Y, more so than any other electric vehicle I've seen on Earth. You know, most EVs just kind of pick one battery supplier or one chemistry or one battery size, and they just sort of stick with it and mass produce that wherever they can. But Tesla will pull batteries from different suppliers in different parts of the world, especially for the Model Y, just so that they can secure their margins and have a product that fits the market best. So I'm in the United States, and I think most of my viewers are, so I'm going to start with what Model Ys are available here. And that includes, on the higher end, the long range and the performance, which are basically still using the exact same 2170 cells that we saw in the Model 3 performance. It's pretty much the exact same pack too. Around 80 kilowatt hours are in those long range and performance vehicles. So great energy density, reasonable affordability. So that's what a lot of Teslas on the road are still using. But the new player on the block, probably the freshest new cell around town, is the Model Y all-wheel drive. So if you order one of those from Tesla's website, it's coming with 4680 batteries. This is kind of the hype cell that everybody loves to clickbait with, because Tesla is actually the one manufacturing these cells. Not CATL, not Panasonic. Tesla themselves has actually said, we want to get into the cell manufacturing business because we want to accelerate the transition to sustainable energy, which is cool, right? So the 4680 cell, now 46 millimeters across, still cylindrical, so it's still circular, but then 80 millimeters down. So this is quite a bit bigger than a traditional 2170 cell, and Tesla dives into a lot of depth about this cell at Battery Day, which is nearly 3 years old now. But essentially the main focus of the 4680 cell was about manufacturing scalability. They want to be able to crank out a lot of these cells really fast, and for not that big a floor space on a factory line, and also of course for pretty cheap. So they're building these right now in Fremont and in Giga, Texas, and these cells of course can hold a lot more energy, but because they're bigger, they take up more space. So overall you need less cells total in the battery pack, less connectors, less robots to actually arrange the cells in an optimal format inside the Model Y. And Tesla, because they're looking for ways to reduce cost and reduce complexity so they can ramp up faster. The weird thing about 4680 cells, unlike those other cells that we talked about, is they can actually be structural. They can hold the vehicle together rather than just be a bunch of cylindrical cells dumped into a battery pack, which then that pack has to be held by other structural components. Tesla wants to eliminate that excess structure, so 4680 cells have thicker cell walls on them so that they can hold part of the vehicle together, and that reduces complexity, reduces parts, makes the car cheaper to build. And that's why I think the Model Y all-wheel drive is probably one of their best sellers, is because it's a great product, it's got decent range at a reasonable price, and of course because it's still manufactured in the US, it qualifies for the full $7,500 tax credit, but it's still relying on nickel, manganese, and cobalt, so it's not the kind of cell you can charge to 100% every single day without some kind of degradation. But some of you may be wondering, okay, these cells sound great, why isn't Tesla using them on everything? Well, in time they might get better, and there's some speculation going on right now on how the energy density may improve, but that's just it. Because the cell walls are so thick, and because they're optimized for scaling up production very quickly, and Tesla's trying some new manufacturing methods with them. This is already a long video, I know, so I'm not getting into the nitty-gritty details, but the 4680 cells are actually per kilogram not as energy dense as the 2170 cells. So even though, yes, they hold more energy, they are bigger, so you can't put as many in the car, and that's why they're using them on essentially a standard range Model Y, not a long range Model Y, because their cells are not as energy dense, at least right now, and that may change in the future. But most of the advantages of the 4680 cell are to Tesla, not so much the end consumer. But over in China, it's a little bit of a different story because they're closer to CATL, where the lithium iron phosphate battery packs are manufactured. So the rear-wheel drive Model 3, just like the US, also uses lithium iron phosphate, but in China, which also exports to Australia and Europe, they're also using lithium iron phosphate, you know, non-cylindrical cells in the standard range Model Y too, which is rear-wheel drive there. So that means depending on your country, you might get lithium iron phosphate in your base price Model Y, but here in the United States, no, you're still getting 4680 cells, which are nickel, manganese, and cobalt. And in case you're wondering why those nickel-based cells are cylindrical, whereas the iron-based cells are prismatic or rectangular, I think a lot of it comes down to heat dissipation. So the cylindrical cells, like the 1865s and 2170s, there's gaps between those cells that allows them to dissipate heat and also put active cooling systems in between, because when you're using your car at high speed or you're fast charging it, most Teslas peak out at around 250 kilowatts, that battery pack can get really hot. So you want a way for it to cool down, whereas the iron-based batteries, they don't get substantially hot because it's a more stable chemistry. It's not as energy dense, so you want to, for space efficiency, make them as boxy as possible so that they take up the most amount of space, and because it's more stable, they don't get as hot. The cooling system doesn't have to be as direct on the side of the cells as much as it does with Tesla cylindrical cells. So there's pros and cons to each, but Giga Shanghai at least is building vehicles with both lithium iron phosphate and 2170 cells, and also there's a chance they might be making the switch to lithium iron manganese phosphate, but again, we don't know that for sure. And now, last piece of the Model Y puzzle, which is kind of interesting, is the rear-wheel drive, standard range Model Y they're building in Berlin is actually using imported cells from a Chinese company called BYD that's called the Blade battery pack. So these are not cylindrical, really long, flat batteries. That's why they call them the Blade, is because they're very thin and sharp. But these are relying on an iron-based chemistry as well, like LFP, but supposedly they're partly structural, and Tesla has not built a lot of them quite yet, so we haven't seen a breakdown on whether or not they really are structural or how much of the internal chassis they're saving with that BYD Blade battery pack. But the good news is the charging curve is reportedly much better with the Blade battery pack compared to the CATL prismatic battery pack. We're seeing that they're able to retain their peak charge speed for longer, which is a good sign, and because it's lithium iron phosphate, it should be at a reasonable price. But that right now is only coming out of Giga Berlin. That's not coming out of any US factory or any factory in China as of right now, but that's some of the new battery pack methods they're experimenting with right now. And of course, I'm sure some of you are wondering what the Cybertruck is going to use, and Tesla hasn't explicitly told us other than that they expect that it needs 4680 cells, and that's likely going to help with the structural battery pack because the Cybertruck is using an exoskeleton design rather than the traditional body on frame design. So we're pretty sure that the Cybertruck is going to be using 4680 cells, which, right now at least are not too energy dense and cheap to build, which means that the Cybertruck will probably have really good profit margins, but my prediction is that the range of the first edition Cybertruck is not going to be terribly high, maybe just a little over 300 miles. But there's others speculating out there that Tesla has next generation 4680 cells with thinner cell walls and a higher concentration of nickel, which should allow for higher energy density, which translates to more range, but that's all speculation. We don't know for sure. And there's a lot of details I'm skimming over to keep this video relatively short, but those are kind of the basics of understanding of what chemistries and what formats Tesla is using across their vehicle lineup. But are there any other questions you guys may have as far as battery packs go? I'd love to try to make the discussion about voltages and battery packs and charging more accessible to the masses, so let me know if you want to do more beginner videos like this. And thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. It seriously helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. So thanks again. Have an excellent rest of your day.